Maria,
Yes, ma'am.
I just want to say thank you so much for
You
joining us,
got it.
Maria.
You got
I'm
it.
so happy to have you on the Spiritually Inspired podcast because, as you know, I love astrology. Everyone listening loves astrology. I know it gets a lot of hate out there by the muggles, but I don't care. I think it's amazing and it's beautiful and it's really interesting. And if it doesn't resonate, it doesn't resonate. That's fine. But if it does, like it tends to like really resonate with people. But this is an interesting concept because I personally have been exploring this idea of like spiritually inspired parenting ever since I
Mhm,
became a mom almost 4 years
mhm.
ago. And today we're talking about astrology inspired parenting because that's your entire brand. That's like everything that you talk
Right.
about on your podcast and everything that you do. So we're talking about this today. And I just want to say thank you for sharing your wisdom with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sarah, for having me. I'm
Yeah.
really, really excited to be here. This is a topic I am really passionate about.
Yeah. Yeah, I can tell for sure. So I always like to start these sort of conversations with like laying some groundwork, just kind of just defining what the heck we're talking about. So first, we all understand what astrology is at this point. We're not really talking about that. What I want to know is why is astrology helpful in positive parenting in the first place? Like why does this topic even matter?
Gotcha. So you're right. Like you said, Sarah, there are different branches of astrology, different ways that astrologers practice. You can practice everything from astrocartography, which is plotting, the best places for you to live based on your birth chart and your life goals. You can practice mundane astrology, which is the astrology of events, like what is happening, what transits are happening during certain events. So what patterns do we see? You could practice horary astrology, which is that's more consistent with similar to tarot, where you ask a question and you want a specific answer to this question, like what's the best time to do X or accomplish X. So you could use it for that. The way I use astrology is more for personal development, personal growth, and for relationship building. So, and by that, I mean, we're essentially looking at natal astrology. So the
Mm-hmm.
study of the individual's birth chart, which for those people who may not know, that is the birth chart is a snapshot of the position of the planets at the moment of an individual's birth. Now, we can talk later on about what planets we're talking about and how to look at that. You can really get down in the weeds with
Oh
this, but
yeah.
essentially that's what we're talking about. That's the birth chart is the snapshot of the position of the planets at the moment of an individual's birth. So it's different for everyone. You may have people of the same generation with some similar placements because those particular planets are very slow moving.
Mm-hmm.
And then you may have what we call the personal planets, which are planets that have more of an effect on the chart holder's temperament and personality. So that's how I use astrology. It's a modality for personal development. And I love using natal astrology because when we're talking about conscious parenting, for example, one of the tenets of conscious parenting is the child is their own sovereign entity, not an
Mm-hmm.
extension of the parents. The child has a different temperament. They may develop different values. They may have different communication and learning styles. They may have different emotional needs from the parent. And that is borne out in the birth chart. So the child having a separate birth chart from the parent reinforces that central tenet of conscious parenting and positive parenting, which the child is a separate entity from the parent to be nurtured. And the way I look at it is the universe has entrusted the parent with kind of guardianship of this soul for this lifetime iteration, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you're guiding this soul through this iteration on Earth at this time. So,
No pressure.
right. So exactly, no pressure, right? And we're going to make mistakes. So we can talk later about that and how you don't need to be perfect and why it's good for your kids to see your imperfections.
Yes.
But that's how I think about it. It's essentially a tool for personal development. More specifically, it's a tool for understanding your authentic self, because I work with a lot of parents who, like me, had to repress the authentic self when they were kids. Because I always quote Gabor Mate here, the physician who works with trauma and reparenting. When kids are faced with this dilemma of attaching to their caregiver or being their authentic selves, attachment wins every time because they have to attach.
I see.
So,
Yeah,
so many people suppress their authentic selves.
for sure.
So a lot of people get to adulthood and they tell me, I'm not sure who I am. I'm not sure what I like. I'm not sure what I even want out of life. And the birth chart is actually a really good way for starting that inquiry. So
Mm.
that's how I use it, essentially. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely think a lot of people can relate to like growing up and not realizing I don't know what I want. I don't know who I am. Because I think it takes a really special aware parent to nurture that before adulthood, especially when you have like teenagers. Like you have teenagers, so you understand maybe
Yes.
like trying to help them like be who they are and not like force things upon them.
Right.
But I feel like most parents don't do that maliciously. Most of them are
Right.
just thinking like, oh, I love this and it's important to me, therefore I'm going to make sure you love it and it's important to you too, and
Right.
that might not necessarily be what's best for them. So yeah, all kinds of things to dive
Yeah.
into there. That's why you have a whole podcast about this, right?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. It's most parents, and like you said, Sarah, it doesn't come from a bad place, but there's a lot of societal pressure to conform to, what people consider the kind of the mainstream way of navigating life, right? Get good
Yeah.
grades, get into good college, get a good job, and then get married and have a family, and now you're set.
Yep.
And that's not necessarily what brings people fulfillment. Could be, yes, that
Hmm.
could be, that's great,
Sure.
or could not be. So the parents, trying to guide the kids toward that more mainstream path comes from a good place because it may have worked for the parents, or they may want the kids to have an easier life. But a lot of the times the people closest to us, they don't necessarily want what's best for us or what's going to bring us fulfillment. They want to keep us safe
Mm.
and keep, so it doesn't come from a bad place, like you said, but also like at some point, parents especially have to kind of let go and let the kids and young adults, make their own decisions and make their own mistakes, because that's part of life. They're going to have to learn to handle that. It's difficult to do because of all the pressure you get from grandparents, other parents, schools, pressure on grades, pressure to perform. So yeah, it takes a really strong and secure parent, I think, to follow their own intuition
Hmm.
instead of following what others pressure them to do. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a cousin who her kids they're a little bit older now. I think they're all in elementary school, but she had a little girl who would not sleep. Right. And if you have babies or are
Mm,
familiar with babies at all, like it's back to sleep. We put your baby down on your back to sleep. That's safe, the safest way. That is the best way to do it. And it is truly probably like for most babies the best way to do it. But
right.
I'm telling you, when I tell you that girl did not sleep until the mom followed her own intuition. My cousin followed her intuition and put that baby to sleep on her stomach, and she
Hmm.
slept. And it worked out for her. Of course, that's anecdotal, but
Right.
I mean, it's an example of she knew that's how it was going to be okay for her daughter, and she trusted that.
Right.
And maybe
Right.
it was a little bit of a risk, and but
Right.
it worked out for her. And I could think of other
Right.
examples in my own life too, with my own son and my daughter, and the things that we choose to do that go against conventional either advice or wisdom
Hmm.
or ideas that ultimately work out for us. And I
Right.
think it's important to have that framework, because if the professionals or the people out there didn't say this is what generally works, this is where you should start, if they didn't have that, then it would be chaos, right? And
Absolutely.
we
Yeah.
would have no frame of
Yeah.
reference at all. But I mean, we start with what we know works for most people. It doesn't work, then we can kind of experiment. So that's kind of what I've been doing. And yeah, it's
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah. Part of
So
parenting is trying to figure out what works. Okay, this didn't work. Maybe this will work. And, teaching our kids independence is essential because we are gearing them up for, you know, to leave the
yeah,
household and we let go, right?
supposedly right at some point.
Right.
Yeah.
Supposedly, hopefully, fingers crossed, right? So, but forcing independence before they're ready, emotionally and psychologically
Yeah.
ready, is also harmful because they need that. In psychology, they talk about that secure base. So kids
Yes.
need the secure base, and part of that is when that they want to be, for example, sleep with, on the parent when they're babies, or when they're a little bit older, like elementary school. A lot of them want to have the parent in the room
Hmm.
sitting somewhere until they fall asleep. It's because they have that need for some reason.
Yeah.
And even, it's interesting because even older kids and even teenagers, sometimes they'll like call the parent or call for the parent in the house. I've experienced this and others have too. And the parent will be like, yeah, what's up? Oh, nothing. I just wanted to know where you were.
Yeah. My daughter does that all the
Yeah.
time.
It's
Mhm.
they need to know where the parent is all
Yes.
the time.
It's that circle of
Yeah.
security where
Yeah.
like
And
when they're starting to be little and they're like starting to kind of explore the world in the room that you're in, and then eventually they'll come back to you and get some cuddles, and then they'll go back out, and then as they get older the circle gets bigger and bigger and bigger.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But they're and they may not even understand consciously why they're doing that.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, hey mom, yeah, what's up? Nothing.
Oh, nothing.
Like, what do you want? I'm thinking, what do you want? And then I realized, oh yeah, he's just making sure I'm around.
Right.
You know, and if they're away from you, whether with the other parent, if you're in a co-parenting situation like I am, or if they're, you know, traveling, sometimes they want to call, hey, I just wanted to say hi. Okay, cool. Well, I'm glad you called. That's why they need to know. And a co-parenting situation, I'm actually presenting at a co-parenting summit in a couple of weeks. And it is essential that the kids know, if you're in two different households, it's essential the kids know where the other parent is. So they may call to ask, hey, what are you doing? Are you at home, or are you out, or what's going on? Just because they want the safety of knowing that you're there and that you're okay.
Yes, absolutely. In the same way that we want to know where they are, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Yep. So all of that is just kind of like parenting in general, not specific to astrology, but it's all relevant, right? It's all relevant. So when we look at a kid's natal chart, I don't know about you, but when my kids are born, I looked at their charts, like basically like in the hospital and while I was holding them. So if we're doing that, what are some like key placements? You mentioned personal planets.
Right.
So what should, if a parent is going to look at their child's natal chart for some insights on their kid, what are some key placements that we should be looking at and focusing on?
Sure. So if you're new to astrology, I want to caution parents by being very careful about what sources you're using.
Thank you.
I mean, so I'm happy to provide a list of sources of reputable astrologers.
Yeah.
Some of which are psychotherapists. A lot more therapists and family therapists are incorporating astrology into their
practices. I love that. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's great. So so that's because parents come to me all the time. I read that this is going to happen. I'm like, you need to calm down and just not read a random source on the internet. So I just want to throw that out there.
Yes.
So if you're new to astrology, I really recommend you stick to first what we call the big three: sun, moon, and rising sign.
Yes.
Right.
Absolutely.
The moon sign is actually going to give you a lot of information if you're looking at your child's chart. And if you're doing what we call a synastry reading, which is a relationship reading where you're comparing your chart and your child's chart to see where there may be some elements of friction and differences that you may, need to put a little bit of extra attention on to understand. And just kind of what you need to know to help your child thrive. So the sun, moon, and rising sign. We can go into a little more detail on what those represent.
Yes. So I do know your sun is kind of like your outward personality. I think most people are pretty familiar with what their sun signs are.
Right.
And we know that a moon is more emotional. But the rising sign, I think people are surprised about, because I hear a lot. People go, well, I'm a Sagittarius, but it doesn't really make sense to me. But then they learn what their rising sign is. They go, that makes so much more sense.
So the rising sign is not always well understood. There's a really well-known child psychotherapist who's an astrologer on the West Coast called Eugenia Kroc, who I've interviewed on my YouTube channel, who's an expert in the rising sign. And I love the way she explains it. The rising sign kind of sets the tone for your life. It is also the way that you automatically, subconsciously project yourself to other people, right? And it is also the way that people perceive you immediately.
Okay.
So I'm a Libra rising. Libra's all about the scales, right? Balancing the scales.
Me as well.
In harmony. Yeah. It's a great placement for a mom, I think. So I am constantly middleman, constantly the diplomat interpreting between two sides. But it's not always super comfortable for me because my other placements are a little different. So, but it's also a sign, it's an air sign, and it's a relationship-oriented sign. It can be indecisive. That's just an element of it being an air sign. It's indecisive. Preoccupied with what the other person in the relationship wants. So you have to focus more on what you want, right? So so that's how I like to explain the rising sign. It sets the tone for your life. It is how you automatically and unconsciously project yourself to others and how others immediately perceive you. Whereas the sun sign is like, kind of as you mentioned, Sarah, it represents kind of how you attack life, how you show up on the stage of life. I also like to think of it as, almost everything through the chart is seen through the filter of the sun sign, in my
Sure.
opinion. So
Yeah,
it
yeah, yeah.
colors, it kind of illuminates the rest of the chart, kind of gives a flavor to everything else in the chart.
Absolutely. I would totally agree with that. So my daughter is I'm looking at, okay. She's an Aquarius and a Pisces and a Taurus.
It's Aquarius sun.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And I'm a Libra sun. I think I
Okay.
misspoke there. Libra sun, Pisces, um, Pisces moon.
Okay.
And where is the next one? I'm trying to remember. Oh yeah, that's what it is. Libra, Pisces moon, and then Pisces rising.
Oh,
So
Pisces rising. Okay.
yes,
Yeah. Yeah.
lots of
So a lot of,
emotion here.
yeah. So the work that you do is totally consistent with the Pisces
Oh, you
energy.
think so? Oh, I
Oh
appreciate
yeah.
that.
Oh yeah. No question. Because Pisces is associated with the 12th house, which is an open gate.
Yeah,
It's an open gate to the other plane. So it's totally consistent that with the work that you do, you're helping
yeah.
people pretty much bring things from, when you manifest, you're bringing things from another plane basically into your existence, your experience,
absolutely.
right? So yeah, very cool.
So maybe if my lovely mother had known that when I was younger, maybe she would have chosen some different things. Or now that I can look at my daughter's natal chart
Right.
and go, I'm just using my daughter as an example because I have it right in front of me. But
Sure.
now I look at hers and I go, oh, you're Taurus rising,
Mhm.
which not only explains a lot, but maybe can help me make different choices for not only like things that we do together, but how
Right.
we communicate, and maybe things that she might potentially be interested in or things that
Right.
she's going to care about. That's kind
Right.
of what we're doing here, right? When we look at natal
Right.
charts, we're
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. So it's different from Aquarius energies. Aquarius sun, Taurus rising, but
right.
Taurus is a fixed earth sign. So Taurus values what it can physically experience, like things it can touch, things it can feel, right? With all the five senses. Like it values things that it can experience with all the five
Yes.
senses. Yeah, and it's an extremely stabilizing energy. Like it's a great placement. Like my Taurus mom friends, I love them because they are like the rock for the kids, right? So it's a very stabilizing energy, which is good because having an air sun can be like all over the
Oh
place.
yeah,
So it
absolutely.
can work to stabilize that. Like I resonate with that. I have an air sun and an earth moon, and if it weren't for my earth moon, I would never get anything done. I would just be like, let me like learn about this. Oh, this will be something cool to do right now. No, you're gonna do this until it's accomplished. Then you can get your carrot and do whatever, right?
It's funny
So
that you
yeah.
say that because I definitely recently have been working with her on that, mostly because I also think that she might have ADHD. I know she's really young. It's hard
She's
to,
young still, so yeah, but
yeah,
it's good that
but
you're thinking about that
yeah,
already. Yeah.
she just is showing a lot of the signs that my husband supposedly showed when, according to my mother-in-law, and he has
Gotcha.
ADHD. So
Oh,
I'm
gotcha.
thinking like it's
It is
probably
genetic, so yeah,
right.
yeah.
So it's gonna be there. So I've been trying to help her like focus on things, like coloring, for example. The other night she was
Right.
coloring this little tiny picture, and she like drew a couple lines, and then she was like wanting to walk away. And I was like, no, let's finish this first, and then you can go do whatever else. And then she was so happy by the time she finally finished the colored picture, like, look, the whole thing is blue or whatever.
Right.
And then she
Right.
went on and moved over. So yeah, she could definitely we're working on focus for sure. But she's also
Sure.
4. I mean,
Yeah, it's good that
yeah.
you're like developmentally she's what she can do right now. And also
Right.
like it's good that when kids finish something, they're learning, it helps their self-esteem, right? They're learning,
Absolutely.
I can do this.
Yes.
I can do it.
Absolutely.
I can finish it. I had that talk with my son he's 15. So we're in another stage over here. But I did something the other day and I finished it and I told him, I don't know, he needed my attention for something. And I said, I'm going to just let me finish what I'm doing because this is something very important and it'll take me a few minutes. And like, you remember, that sensation that you have when you've accomplished something and you feel good? He goes, oh yeah, yeah. I said, that's where I'm going with this right now. Like, just let me finish this. I need 5 minutes.
Give me a second.
And I could be, I've done this right for the day. So yeah, it's good to like think about that and share that with them so that, that's,
absolutely. And there's so many different things to look at with, like you mentioned earlier with astrology, but if you're looking at like just the sun can tell you so much about how they behave. The moon can tell you a lot about how they behave, and their rising can tell you a lot about what they want to do. So besides those 3, let's just say we have a good handle on those 3. We want to dig a little bit more. What else?
Sure.
What other insights can be provided like on their temperament and like their behavior patterns? Like where can we find that sort of information?
Right. The we'll go to the personal planets. So I would go next to the personal planets. So
Mm.
moon is a personal planet, sun, moon, Venus, Mercury, Mars. So the personal planets will inform a lot about the chart holder's temperament, characteristics, how they show up in certain situations, things like that. The moon will inform a lot of that, especially with kids, because like you said, the moon rules the emotional life of the chart holder. It is really important to look at the moon when you're looking at relationship astrology, because the moon will inform how you subconsciously respond to anything that deals with your emotions, what you need to feel emotionally safe, how you show up in one-to-one relationships too. So it'll inform all that. So yeah, so that's really important when you're looking at like your chart, the parent and the child's chart together. So the other personal planets we're talking about, Venus, Mercury, Mars. Mercury is a personal favorite of mine because I'm a Gemini, and my Mercury placement is 0 degrees Gemini. It is ridiculous.
Wow.
So, I love Mercury. It's it informs my life. Like my body moves way too slowly for my mind, and it is a source of constant frustration for me.
I believe it. I was going to ask you what your sun sign was. So Gemini.
Yeah, so I have a Gemini sun and Gemini Venus and Gemini Mercury. My Mercury says 0 degrees Gemini, so it's like it's a lot of air energy up in here.
A lot of it.
Yes. So Mercury will inform the communication style of the chart holder. Also, it will inform the learning style of the chart holder. Okay, so, and you have to look at, we haven't talked about this yet, and I don't want to throw too much information. So when we're looking at a chart, we're also looking at the house placements of the planets.
Yes.
Okay. So we're looking at the sign of the planets. So the planets, I like how relationship astrologer Stephen Arroyo, who's also a psychologist, I like how he phrases this. So the planets are energies, and the signs of the planets in the natal chart is how that particular planet's energy is expressed, right?
Yes. It's like its clothes.
Exactly. And then the houses the planets are in are the themes, kind of the life themes that are related to the energy expression.
Yes.
That makes sense.
Yes.
So you'll hear some people equate the house with the planet or the house with the sign. That's not accurate in my opinion. So, but the houses represent themes of life that may be associated with a planet. Like the 8th house is the house associated with Scorpio. So the 8th house rules themes of like death, rebirth, transformation, things like that. So those are Scorpio themes, right? So there is some link. So, and depending what type of astrology you're studying, that may be explained differently. But yeah, so you would look at, my point here is, in my long-winded Gemini fashion, is that when you're looking at the personal planets, you're looking at the signs, but you're also looking at the houses. For example, I have Mercury in the 8th house. That's a house associated with Scorpio. It gives me a very dark sense of humor.
I love it.
My son has Mercury in Scorpio. He's a Scorpio sun, for better or worse. He has a dark sense of humor because his Mercury is in Scorpio. So, for example, those will inform a lot about the communication style of the chart holder and the learning style of the chart holder.
Okay.
So the planet Venus is also very important when we're looking at one-to-one relationships because it rules how you manage the give and take in relationships. Because Venus is naturally ruled by Libra, other way around. Venus naturally rules Libra and Taurus in traditional astrology. Right. So, so it very much informs how the chart holder will manage one-to-one relationships, how they'll manage the give and take in relationships. So as the kids get older and start to have more friendships and then more romantic relationships, that's helpful to know because that's when, they need a lot of guidance.
Right.
Learning about relationships and how to manage those things is really important, especially now with social media. They have access to more people. So that can get to be very important as kids get older and start to have those relationships. And the parent, if you look at the chart and you can see this, you can kind of know what direction to take and how to help them manage that and what kind of things to bring up.
Right. And the way to go about it too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like I'll give you an example without giving too much information. My son has his sun in Scorpio and his Venus in Scorpio, and they're both in the 7th house. Okay. So that's the house of one-to-one relationships. It can also it can also indicate like partnerships, business relationships, but it's largely the house of the partner, right? The main partner in the relationship.
Sure.
So clearly, if you have your son there, one-to-one relationships are going to dominate your life. They're going to be very important to you. So, that's something that early on I made sure I, communicated to my son about, like, when you start to talk to people or start to date or whatever, like, we need to have these conversations clearly, because relationships are going to be very important to you. That is something that is very different from me. I am like a rugged individualist. I'm a loner, like I'm comfortable on my own, like that kind of thing. So that's a good example of something where, although my son and I have a lot of similarities, there are certainly differences in our charts, and that's one of them. Is that the one-to-one relationships I think are more important for him than they are for me. So I have to recognize that and kind of honor that about him.
Yeah,
right?
it's a way to be really mindful.
Right.
Yeah, I remember I did this when my daughter was first born. I was looking at, because I was curious about like how her relationships were going to be, and I didn't have as good of an understanding as I do right now. I don't think back then, but now I can look and see that, her Venus is Aquarius as well. So it is very airy, kind of all over the place. And I kind of always have taken that as, it's more like the group relationships, like not necessarily one-on-one, but she cares about like the relationship of the entire family. Like she doesn't just want to hang out with me. She wants to hang out with me and her dad. Or it's every time I go, okay, we're going to go to grandma's house, she goes, and grandpa's going to be there too, right? So like I kind of take that as like a little bit of her Aquarius Venus, because she wants it to be a group effort, not just be the one-on-one necessarily. So I think there's a lot of ways to interpret it.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of ways to go into it.
Friendship, it could be like her main relationships are going to involve, like, be based on friendships. And they're going to be related to her social circles. It could also mean that like she's going to need a lot of intellectual stimulation in friendships and relationships.
Yes,
absolutely. The air energy, Venus in Gemini, Venus in Aquarius, those very common. It's a very common trait with those placements.
Absolutely. And it's too early to tell with my son, because he's such a little guy right now. Well, he's not actually. He's pretty big for his age, but he's just a little.
He's young.
I know. He's so
I remember those days. Oh my gosh! I remember the last time my son let me hold him when he was like 5 years old, like this, like rocking.
Oh my god! I mean, you probably could try now. It'd be kind of hard.
He picks me up now.
Oh my god!
He's so tall, it's crazy. I know.
Do you think that if we're a parent and we want to look at our kids' astrology chart, do we need to also be aware of our own chart, or is it enough to just look at their chart and kind of take it from there? Or should we be comparing and be like, okay, well, they need this, but I do it this way, so how does this work? Like, what do you think?
Right. I mean, it's not like essential. If the goal is to understand your child's temperament, communication style, emotional needs, if that's your goal, looking at their chart will be enough, as long as you have the understanding and the openness, right? It is very helpful to look at your own, so you have that understanding of your own authentic self, right? So like I work with a lot of clients who are like me in the process of reparenting themselves while simultaneously parenting their kids. So from that angle, it is certainly beneficial to be looking at your own natal chart, understanding that and how it may differ. And if you're having some issues, if your kids are older, so around like, it's interesting because we could talk about this later too, like you can definitely track certain planetary transits to like development milestones in kids.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about.
We can talk about that too. I don't want to get too far ahead.
No, it's okay.
But age 7, kids really start to separate themselves from the parents. They begin that process. So that age is when you start to have some friction, right? Especially if parents have been a little too authoritarian up to that point, rules focused. And then clearly at like age 13, that becomes even more pronounced. By the time they're teenagers, they're like, I can do this. I'm not doing what you tell me to do, even though it's for my own good, right? Right. Good. So it's a totally different way of handling things. So yeah, it's because parents usually, that's when they'll seek out a coach like me, is when they're starting to have issues. Like my kid used to do everything. They used to manage their schoolwork and do this. And now, even though I'm telling them what to do and I'm helping them and I have more experience, they're just not doing it. They're just not doing it. We're having all these issues. And so then the relationship suffers. That's the last thing you want, because the most important thing is that the relationship is intact.
Mhm.
Lines of communication are intact, because you need your kids to be able to talk to you about anything. So, sorry, I was going to speak Spanish for a second. So todo. Most of all, when bad things are happening to them, they need to feel safe going to mom and dad and talking about, hey, this is happening. How do I deal with this?
Mhm.
So yeah, so there's a potential, depending on how the parent handles it, there's a potential for deepening of the relationship and communication, or communication breakdown, which we don't want. So yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I wonder if you look at a chart and you can maybe predict that might happen, especially if you compare them.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
all the time. People tell me all the time. They'll just give me like the sun signs or the moon signs, and I'm like, "Is this happening?" Yup. And the age of the child, right? Is this happening? Yup. So? Do you? There's a potential for this dynamic. Yeah, that's exactly what's happening. I'm like, yeah. Well, here's what we need to do to address
Yeah,
this.
right.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, the parent. It especially happens when the energies are just so different.
Mm,
And you look at, and we haven't talked about this yet, but you can look at the positions of the planets to themselves, right? The angles of the
yes,
planets, right?
right.
So, and when we do a synastry comparison, you can look at the angles of the planets of the parent and the child, and kind of whether you can determine whether there's a lot of friction or whether things run smoothly regarding those particular energies. So when you look at that, there's a potential there. So unless the parent is like really self-aware and is already working on those things, you could almost always predict some elements of friction. Yeah.
Yeah. And I would like to think that if they're coming to you for help, they're probably have at least some level of
Yeah,
self-awareness. Like,
absolutely. And we like we said at the beginning of the interview, nobody's perfect and we all make mistakes, and the most self-aware parent makes mistakes.
yeah,
Right? We do.
absolutely.
So yeah, you don't have to be perfect. That's not really the goal, right? The goal is just
Right.
to be authentic and
Yeah.
and
there
maintain
for
the good
them.
relationship. Yeah.
And I personally think this isn't necessarily astrology related, but you mentioned this before earlier, but I personally think that it's really important that your child hears you say I'm sorry to them. Like
Absolutely.
when like yesterday, for example, I was in a mood and I was not having it, and I got very upset a couple times yesterday, and I yelled when I don't normally, and I felt really bad. And so like at bedtime, like we were talking about it, I was like, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to yell at you. It's not your fault. You didn't necessarily do anything wrong. This is what we're working on. And by the end of it, she goes, it's okay, mama. And then she gives me like a cheesy smile. And I'm like, oh, I really appreciate that. But yeah, I
That's
think it's so
awesome.
important that your kid hears you say, I'm sorry. And
Absolutely.
that might be hard for people who aren't self-aware, as
Yeah,
you probably
absolutely.
know.
Yeah. And you don't lose any authority as a parent by apologizing. And
Right.
so I think that's a fear I think a lot of parents may have, is that, well, I'm losing authority, or it shows my imperfections. Well, you're not perfect. And guess what? Your kid knows that. You don't have to tell them that. Your
Yeah,
kid sees how you act and they know you're not perfect, but that's fine. Like,
exactly.
imagine if you were perfect and that's the standard your kid now has to live up to. They're never going to, meet that. None of us are going to meet that
Right.
standard 100% of the time. So the kids, it's more meaningful for them to see the parents make mistakes and cope and go on with life.
Mm-hmm. Vital.
That's more important than to see the parents perfect all the time.
Right. And I remember realizing like that my parents weren't perfect. I was probably an adolescent, right? Realizing like, oh, my parent is like a person in the world with like a history and their own thoughts and opinions. And of course, like you objectively know this, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when you are coming of age yourself and you start to realize like, oh, things aren't perfect, like that could potentially, if what I have seen in other relationships, like other people, I've seen that the parent tries to present themselves as perfect. The child realizes they're not perfect. The parent is still trying to go along with the facade of perfection. The kid is like going, like you got some problems. And then the rift really starts to happen.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think just being real and authentic, no matter what, is the most important thing. And
Absolutely.
astrology is definitely one of those ways where you can be, like you said earlier, like it's how you understand your authentic self.
Right.
Especially as it relates to the most important people in your life, the little ones.
Absolutely.
Even when they're taller than you and they're not so little anymore.
Oh my gosh, it's crazy. You gave birth to this giant human.
Oh my God. For the longest time, I looked at my kids and I'm like, you like came out of my body. You came out of my body. Like that blows my mind.
Yeah.
Even now. Okay, so here's another thing that I wanted to ask about. You've
Sure.
only mentioned a son, so I'm not sure if you have more than one, but I am curious, how can this information, astrology, help address sibling dynamics? Like, how can you
Mm,
compare the sibling
y-
relation or charts and be like, this is gonna be
yes.
interesting.
So I only have one. He's my buddy. But I'm the oldest of three kids, and we
Okay.
are so different. Um, well, there's some similarities. It's funny because like when you do like family constellation, when you do like family charts, like maybe 5 people in the family, and you're doing charts for everybody, you'll see the same energies, like in maybe not the same placements, but like the same prominent energies. Like
Interesting.
Scorpio runs through my family, for better or worse. I cannot avoid these people.
In the best way, no.
In the best way. And I love Scorpio people, man. And clearly the universe thought that I needed to understand these people more because it gave me a Scorpio child, right? So yeah, I have a Scorpio. My dad was a Scorpio sun. My mom has a Scorpio Mars. My sister has a first house Pluto, which is in modern astrology is the ruler of Scorpio. In the first house, my son's a Scorpio. My second ex-husband was a Scorpio moon. And I have the North Node in the sign of Scorpio in my first house. So I'm just drawn to these people. And for people who don't know, the North Node is an asteroid, which we use to, which we study to, it'll give us information on the person's kind of cosmic destiny in this lifetime, I want to say, like the energies that they are meant to kind of address in this iteration, right?
Mine is in Sagittarius.
In what house do you have it in?
What house? I'm not sure.
Because that'll inform a lot.
Where is my node? That's a weird sentence. Where is my I don't think that one says. What house is it? You said yours is in what house?
First house.
The first house? Okay.
Yeah. See if Pisces
rising,
it's in so it's got to be what's that?
My fourth house.
Fourth house. Interesting. Yeah. So fourth house rules, that's the house the moon normally would sit in, right? That's the house of home and family. And also, ancestors, right? Ancestral traditions and things like that. So interesting with the work that you do that you have a fourth house node in Sagittarius. So you were also meant to travel in some way, right?
Traveling is like one of my favorite things in the entire world. Everything I do is with the intention of traveling.
There you go. So that is very interesting. That's very consistent with your experience.
Well, I appreciate that.
Yeah, totally. So where are we going with this? You asked about
how all the charts relate back to family matters.
Yes. So it's very common to see the similar energies show up in family charts. Yeah. So you asked about siblings. That's how I got off of this.
Yes.
I remember. You asked about siblings. So so it's interesting because siblings, you can have the same set of genes, but they're so different. And the natal chart will inform a lot of that, like how they're different, right? And they can have different experiences growing up in the same household too, depending on birth order and temperament and how the parents treat them, right? Because parents, sometimes they do have a favorite. I mean, parents will tell you no, but sometimes they do.
Yeah.
So, but it can inform a lot because one of the things parents will tell me is, well, my kids, they're so different. Like this child is like this and this child is a polar opposite. I'm like, yeah, well, it's a different set of your mixture of genes, right? And the chart will inform that. They'll have a different, maybe they have the same sun sign. I mean, I've known parents that the kids had the same sun sign, but the moon signs and rising signs were completely different. That will inform a lot of the differences. The personal planets we talked about, that will inform a lot of the differences. What house the sun sign is in, that will inform a lot of that too. Yeah. So and then you have the aspects to talk about. So, and then when you're doing a relationship reading between siblings, the aspects will inform a lot of that, whether there's friction, whether they get along in certain areas, things like that. So
I can imagine it would be really helpful for
sure.
sure.
Yeah.
So this is more of a curiosity question. If you pull a chart for a relationship reading, do you pull one chart and then the other one and then compare them, or is it like a different chart that you pull?
So what I do is I look at, if we're doing a relationship reading for two people, I'll look at the individual charts and then I'll do a synastry reading where you have software that basically puts one chart on top of the other so that you can see the
I
aspects
see. Okay.
more easily. Yeah.
Yeah.
There are different ways to do that. Like that's kind of the most helpful. That's usually what people are looking for.
Mhm.
Like they want to know about aspects. If you're doing a relationship reading for two adults, one of the questions they want to know is this have the potential for long term? And there are certain aspects you can look at, although I don't really practice predictive astrology.
Yeah.
I think it's too easy to get too hung up on what's going to happen in the future. You're not living in the present, right?
Thanks
And
for saying that.
because of law of attraction, right? If you're thinking about it, it's going to happen. That's why those
Yeah.
parents that come to me, they say, well, I read that this aspect means my kid's going to have a really bad relationship with me, the mom. Well, if you're thinking about that, then it could very well happen if that's what you're concentrating on all the time. But number
Mhm.
one, it doesn't necessarily mean that. Number two, if you're thinking about it, you're going to bring it into your experience. So you want to be very careful about all that. So yeah,
Absolutely.
and especially with kids, like I'm actually helping my friend host a parenting and astrology conference in February. And one of the sessions is specifically on the ethics of reading children's charts.
Ooh, yeah.
Yeah, so you want to be really careful about being too predictive. Also, I would probably not do a reading for an adult who did not give me consent to look at their chart, right?
Sure.
Not do a
Yeah.
full reading. It depends on what questions the client is asking, but you want to be careful about that. Like if somebody wants a synastry reading for them and their child, but their child is legally an adult, I don't have the child's permission to do a full chart reading. I mean, I would be really leery about doing that because
Yeah.
we have consent. So, because the chart can tell you a lot of information.
Oh, absolutely.
So
Yeah.
yeah, so those are, I know we don't have time to go into detail about that, but those are obviously important topics to think about when you're doing this kind of work.
I totally agree. It's very similar for tarot. Like I often
Yeah,
get people coming and
yeah,
saying like, I want to know about this event in this person's life. And I'm like, well,
yeah,
ask them. I'm not sorry. Like
yeah,
ethics are really important in this sort of
yeah.
thing. And some people get mad when you have boundaries and ethics, but
Right,
gotta do
right.
what you gotta do. So
That's
I
right.
wanted to ask you something a little bit more personal. And I'm interested to hear what you're gonna say. What is the biggest lesson that this work has taught you about parenting?
Oh my gosh, so many lessons.
Yeah, I can
The
imagine.
biggest lesson, I guess, the biggest lesson is that I'm just the parent is really meant to. I think we kind of hinted at this earlier. The parent is really meant to guide this soul through this lifetime. The parent is not meant to tell this soul what to do all the time or make sure they conform to a certain set of standards, however you define that. But it's really about guiding them on their own journey,
Mm,
right? And, that also means giving them a framework and a structure for, how to be a good person. I don't want to, go without saying that, but it is really about, and especially as they get older, it's about letting go more and trust that you have done the work and you have built the relationship with them for them to be true to themselves, right?
yes.
That's kind of the biggest kind of overarching lesson, I think. Yeah,
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. Thank you for
yeah,
sharing. I appreciate it.
absolutely,
Yeah. And thank you so much for answering all our questions
absolutely.
today. This is such a really great topic because we all love astrology and we all look at ourselves, but that it's like this is like applied astrology, like where you're
Right,
using it in like the most practical way possible
right.
with relationships, but some of the most important relationships with your own kids. So you have your whole podcast all about this.
Oh my
Can you
gosh.
tell us
Yeah.
where we can find
So,
you?
yes, I'm on YouTube at Positive Parenting with Astrology with Maria Riegger, and we do weekly content. And we have a pretty active subscriber base, and they request certain videos. And I do a lot of content on like parent-child dynamics, and for example, Aquarius parent, Scorpio child, like what are the things that may come up. Yeah, and we do a lot of content on reparenting and a lot of astrology focused content. So really exciting stuff.
Yeah. Yay. Definitely go check it out. I know I've already listened to a few of them and I really like them. So yay.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you for being here. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sarah.